El doctor Daniel nos va a platicar sobre su trabajo sobre evolución en aves. El doctor Phil es paleontólogo, es experto en la evolución de aves, combinado con estudios de filogenia fósil y molecular, precisamente de este grupo de especies. Ha publicado varios artículos acerca de la evolución de aves, incluyendo la evolución del vuelo. Entonces, bueno, es profesor asistente en Cambridge, y en la Universidad de Bath está en una posición que se llama Prize Fellow. Y bueno, pues nada, nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Y pues vamos a escuchar.
Okay, gracias. Okay. Buenas tardes. ¿Cómo están todos y todas? Tengo un problema? No. Okay. Yes, so hi, I'm Daniel Field. I'm currently at the University of Bath, just like Paula. And next month I'll start a position at the University of Cambridge, where I'm mostly going to study the evolution of birds using the fossil record. So in the talk that I want to give today, I want to give you a bit of an understanding of why birds are an interesting group to study from this perspective, and the sorts of insights that the very early fossil record of bird-like animals can provide us with in terms of understanding how modern bird diversity has come to be. So in the modern world, birds are the most diverse and globally distributed group of tetrapod animals. There are almost 11,000 living species, and of course they exhibit an incredible degree of disparity, of variety in their colors and their forms and their lifestyles. So I'm interested in trying to use the fossil record in order to piece together how and when and ultimately why this incredible diversity has come to be. So as somebody who primarily studies fossils, I mostly think of myself as a vertebrate paleontologist, but somewhat unusually amongst paleontologists, I also spend a lot of time in the field observing and photographing wild birds, and I do that because I think that getting a sense of the kinds of behavioral disparity that living birds exhibit is a great way to come up with the sorts of evolutionary hypotheses that we can then try to test using the fossil record later on in the lab. So over the course of today's talk, I want to focus on sort of one topic in particular, and that topic is the value of fossils in terms of telling us how and when and why major changes that have led to what we think of as modern bird features have come to be. So that's over there in the top left, using the early fossil record to piece together those sorts of answers to big evolutionary questions. But the research that I do touches on a few other topics in bird macroevolution and paleontology as well. I'm also interested in using much more recent fossils in order to help clarify where groups of living birds were formerly distributed and how climatic changes may have driven changes in the geographic distributions of those major groups of birds. I'm also interested in using a phylogenetic evolutionary understanding of modern birds to give us a clearer understanding of how major events in Earth history, like the famous mass extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous period that eliminated non-avian dinosaurs, of course the asteroid impact that set off that extinction event occurred here in Mexico in the Yucatan. I'm interested in trying to understand how events like those throughout the history of life have influenced the evolution of major groups of organisms, such as birds. And finally, I try to use phylogenetic methods in order to give us a clearer picture about how important biological features of major groups like birds have come to be. But like I said, we're going to focus on the early fossil record of modern birds over the course of the talk today. But before we actually get into fossils themselves, If we're going to think about the early fossil record of modern birds, we actually need to think about where birds sit in the broader vertebrate tree of life. So what we're looking at here is a phylogenetic picture of vertebrate animal interrelationships. And if you try to find birds in that figure, you'll see that birds share a more recent common ancestor with crocodilians than they do with any other groups of organisms. And this is a strongly supported hypothesis based both on molecular sequence data as well as comparative anatomy and the fossil record. So together, we call the group or the clade that unites birds and crocodilians Archosauria. We call these animals the archosaurs, the ruling reptiles, because birds, of course, are reptiles. And the most recent common ancestor of birds and crocodilians, the most recent common ancestor of living archosaurs, is symbolized on the phylogeny there with that circle. But if we're going to use the fossil record in order to understand how those features that make birds unique among vertebrates, things like feathers and warm-bloodedness and the ability to fly, we can't only look at modern species, because all modern birds have feathers, so studying modern birds themselves won't tell us how feathers evolved. Instead, in order to answer questions such as those, we need to turn to one branch on the tree of life in particular, and it's this branch that I'm highlighting in blue right there. So that branch is outside of modern bird diversity, but it's the branch that leads to modern birds from the most recent common ancestor of living birds and living crocodilians. So that branch has a name. We call that branch the avian, the bird stem group. And fossils along that branch include very famous extinct relatives of birds, including all dinosaurs. So turning to that branch will take us back into the fossil record and especially into the Mesozoic, the age of reptiles. So this term, the avian stem group, is a very important term to try to understand, and specifically what it refers to is all fossil taxa that are more closely related to birds than they are to crocodilians, but nonetheless outside of modern bird diversity. So this branch of the tree of life includes lots of fascinating extinct organisms that we love to imagine about. Children are fascinated by stem group birds. So these include things like all of the major groups of dinosaurs, as well as the ancient flying reptiles called pterosaurs, and dinosaurs that are quite closely related to modern birds that became progressively bird-like throughout the age of reptiles. So if we study in a scientific way fossils from the avian stem group, we might be able to come up with answers to some important evolutionary questions about the origin of modern birds themselves. And specifically, fossils along this branch of the tree of life can shed light on some very exciting questions, such as the origin of the very distinctive avian brain, the origin of warm-bloodedness and high metabolic rates in birds, the origin of feathers, one of those specializations that sets birds apart from any other group of living vertebrates, as well as a toothless beak and the ancestral ability to fly. So I'd love to talk about all of those topics today, but in the interest of saving time, I'm going to focus on those topics that I've highlighted in bold there. And I'm going to begin the discussion with maybe the most controversial topic in the history of bird macroevolutionary biology, and that is trying to understand how and when modern flying ability, that sort of flying ability that characterizes living birds, first evolved. So there are a couple of reasons why studying the origin of flight has been such an enduring problem. So people have been interested in studying how modern birds acquired the ability to fly for over 150 years. So one of the most important sort of transitional fossils that has figured very prominently in discussions of the origin of flight is that fossil shown there in the middle of the slide. That's Archaeopteryx from the Jurassic of Germany. It's about 150 million years old, and it was discovered in 1861. So if you think about that in a historical context, it's very interesting. Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. So it was only 2 years later that this really important fossil organism was made known to the world, and it has some very fascinating evolutionary implications, and these were noticed right away. For example, it has big wings with asymmetrical feathers, much like a living bird, and it also has a feathered tail. But if you look at the tail more closely, you can see it's a long, bony tail, the sort of tail that we see in extinct dinosaurs, very much unlike the sorts of tails that we see in living birds, where the bony tail has been reduced to a very, very short stump. Also, the wings have sharp claws on them, and the jaws have sharp teeth inside of them. So in many ways, this animal, Archaeopteryx, is both very bird-like and very much not bird-like. And so because it exhibits this fascinating mix of apomorphic and plesiomorphic bird-like features, paleontologists have long been fascinated by trying to understand whether it could fly or not. And this has been a very controversial topic for two reasons in particular. First of all, historically, it's been quite difficult to estimate exactly how much a fossil bird-like animal actually weighed when it was alive. And secondly, it's historically been challenging to come up with the sorts of skeletal correlates of flying ability that we can very confidently associate with flight in modern birds, which we can then take from modern birds and apply to the fossil record. So in this talk, I'm going to suggest that hopefully we've begun to address both of those concerns. First of all, by generating new and more accurate ways to assess the body mass of bird-like animals from the fossil record, and also by identifying skeletal correlates of flying ability which we can take from modern birds and apply to fossils. So to make a long story short, we became very interested in trying to estimate body mass more accurately in fossil birds several years ago. And so we spent many years measuring the skeletons of modern birds, as many bird skeletons as we possibly could. And all of those data are presented up there at the top of the slide. And it's a little hard to tell, but this is a very large data set indeed. So it incorporates about 13,000 different skeletal measurements for birds all the way across the living bird tree of life. And so our objective was to identify the skeletal measurements that correspond most closely to body mass in living birds. And in doing so, we found some skeletal measurements that correlate very strongly with body size, some skeletal correlates that correspond very poorly with body size. But the most important thing was that we computed various correlations to estimate body size from simple linear measurements of bones, which incorporate estimates of statistical uncertainty. So what I'm showing here is what turned out to be by far the best predictor of body size from measurements of living birds. And as you can see, this particular skeletal correlate corresponds to a measurement of the shoulder joint. So reptiles, such as birds, have a very different sort of shoulder joint to what we do as mammals. We just have a very simple joint whereby our humerus inserts into our shoulder blade, our scapula. But in birds, there are more bones involved. So there's a different bone called the coracoid, which mammals lost early in their evolutionary history, which connects to the scapula, the shoulder blade. And so together, those bones form the joint that the humerus inserts into. So what I'm showing there is the coracoid bone, that bone that forms the shoulder on the front, and specifically we measured the shoulder joint portion of the coracoid. And this is an important measurement because that particular portion of the bird's skeleton tends to get preserved very often in the fossil record. It's very strong and very dense, and therefore it's one of the most common bird fossils that we actually find. And so it was that reason that we decided to look at its correspondence with body mass, and as you can see, we found that it corresponds very closely with body mass indeed, and that holds true across scale. Whether you're a very tiny living bird, like a colibri, or a very heavy living bird like, is the word pelicano? Like a pelicano. So this holds true across body size, the entirety of body size variation of living birds that can fly. But that's the important point there. All of the birds that I'm showing on the plot can fly. And so that raises an important question. What happens when we add data from birds that can't fly to this correlation? Do we see such a tight correspondence between dimensions of the shoulder joint and body size? And it turns out that we don't. When we add flightless birds to this plot, we see that this nice correlation between body size and shoulder dimensions falls apart. And that's not really so surprising. When you think about it, flying birds, if they're larger, need to have larger shoulder articulations in order to disperse the stresses that the shoulder encounters during flight. But if you lose the ability to fly, the shoulder no longer needs to perform that function, and therefore many birds that have become flightless are actually much heavier relative to their shoulder joint dimensions than would be predicted based on this correlation from flying birds. So at first we were a little sad to see that our very beautiful correlation fell apart. It doesn't look so beautiful anymore. But actually, if you look at the correspondence of the different sorts of birds included in this analysis, a very interesting pattern jumps out at you, which is that the flightless birds tend to occupy a very different region of morphospace than the flightless birds do. And it's actually a little more complex than that. It might be a little hard to see, but in the middle of the plot, there's a gray region of morphospace, and that gray region is largely occupied by living birds that can fly, but tend to be relatively heavy-bodied and don't tend to fly over long distances. So in general, this sort of simple relationship between body size and shoulder dimensions appears to sort of circumscribe different functional zones, regions of morphospace occupied by flying birds and flightless birds. And that's really exciting because it suggests that with just a few measurements of the skeleton of Mesozoic fossil bird-like animals, we should be able to take fossils like Archaeopteryx and plot them into this morphospace in order to get an understanding of whether or not these animals would have been capable of sophisticated, modern, powered flying ability. But in order to do that, of course, we need an independent estimate of body mass for the fossils that we're looking at, one that doesn't differ between flying organisms and flightless organisms. And fortunately, several of the correlations that we generated scale roughly the same way for flying and flightless birds, and so that's good. It suggests that we can estimate body size and associated uncertainty, statistical uncertainty in that correlation from measurements of things like the hind limb, and we should then be able to compare those estimates of body size to dimensions of the shoulder joint to see where those birds plot in morphospace. But of course, we don't only have to focus on Archaeopteryx. To orient you, Archaeopteryx is way up here, and living birds, which we call Neornithes, are down here. Throughout the Mesozoic, there was a very rich evolutionary history of bird-like animals, and as you can see, there's a lot of phylogenetic distance between Archaeopteryx and modern birds. So in order to better understand how modern powered flying ability evolved in feathered dinosaurs more generally, we decided to examine these correlations in a wide variety and broad phylogenetic range of feathered dinosaurs from the Mesozoic. So what happens when we take all of these feathered dinosaur measurements and plot them into our modern bird morphospace? Well, when we do that, some very interesting patterns emerge, which I'll get into in a second, but just to give you a sense of what you're seeing here, the statistical uncertainty associated with these different data points is based on the degree of statistical uncertainty in the hind limb correlation with body size. So, what do we actually see? Well, if we return to our phylogeny of these Mesozoic avialans or bird-like feathered dinosaurs, we see some very interesting patterns indeed. So let's talk about Archaeopteryx first. I'm showing Archaeopteryx here in gray, and that's because given the degree of statistical uncertainty in estimates from Archaeopteryx, we find that largely Archaeopteryx overlaps that gray region on the plot, suggesting that indeed Archaeopteryx was probably capable of some form of aerial locomotion, maybe some sort of primitive flight, but it doesn't suggest that it would have been capable of the sophisticated powered flight that characterizes many birds that fly today. In contrast, we see that this group here, characterized in blue, exhibits shoulder dimensions that largely overlap with modern, sophisticated, strong flying birds, suggesting that these Mesozoic organisms probably would have been capable of sophisticated modern flight. So interestingly, Archaeopteryx is not the only one of these feathered dinosaurs to fall sort of within this gray region of morphospace. Instead, we see that the next several most crownward Mesozoic feathered dinosaurs occupy a similar region, suggesting that maybe there was a protracted or longer period throughout the evolutionary history of these feathered dinosaurs whereby these animals exhibited somewhat clumsy, somewhat incipient powered flying ability, and that the origin of modern powered flight itself in a sophisticated way occurred later in bird evolutionary history than is conventionally thought. And very interestingly, we also infer two independent transitions away from flying ability back to flightlessness, suggesting that, much like what we see in living birds like ostriches and penguins, the ability to fly was lost multiple times early in the evolutionary history of birds during the age of dinosaurs. So if we look at this region of the tree right here, where we infer the origin of modern powered flying ability to have taken place, we see that this is actually a very interesting point in bird evolutionary history, because this is a point on the phylogeny where we see the origin of other flight-related features, like the acquisition of very large, enlarged sternum keel. So we term basically this structure here the sternal keel. In modern birds that can fly, this is a region of the skeleton that anchors the very large muscles responsible for powered flight. And additionally, at the same point on the phylogeny, we see the initial acquisition of what we consider to be fully modern asymmetrical feathers associated with the generation of lift during flight. So this appears to have been a very important point in the evolutionary history of bird-like animals for the evolution of flight itself, and it's an area on the phylogeny that we'll need to study more in the future in order to better understand how flight itself came to be. So we're very excited about these results for a couple of reasons. First of all, we think that we've addressed a really long-standing evolutionary mystery in terms of being able to reject the idea that Archaeopteryx would have been capable of sophisticated modern flight. But we also, I think much more generally, come up with some important insights related to the sequence by which powered flying ability itself evolved throughout the age of dinosaurs, and ultimately gave us powered flying ability of the sort that we see in living birds today. So that's sort of a story about the evolution of modern flight, which of course is one of the most distinctive features of modern birds. But from here, I want to talk a little bit more about the importance of going out and finding new fossils that can tell us a lot about how modern bird biology has come to be. So all of these fossil bird-like dinosaurs that we talked about before at some point were dug up largely in China by people just like you and me. So people went out and actually discovered these fossils, which turned out to be very evolutionarily significant. These fossils ended up in museum collections around the world and were available for scientists like me to go and measure. And so that's very nice. It's very convenient to be able to go to a nice natural history museum to collect these sorts of data. But ultimately, all of these data come from exploration in the field. And so that's what I want to talk a little bit about with regard to trying to understand the origin of one of the most distinctive features of modern birds, their distinctive modern bird skull. So trying to understand the evolution of the modern bird skull can be very challenging because most bird fossils tend to be preserved totally flat, usually on a flat slab of rock, which means that the bones, when they're preserved, are usually not three-dimensional, which can make it very difficult to come up with a good three-dimensional understanding of what the skulls of these organisms look like. And indeed, if you look at our phylogeny once again, fortunately, many of these animals are associated with skulls, but once again, almost all of them are preserved flat, pressed into the rock, and generally very difficult to interpret. An especially big problem has to do with this region of the phylogeny close to the origin of modern birds themselves. Because as you can see, many of these evolutionarily significant organisms are not associated with really good skull remains, meaning that we don't really know all that much about the origin of the modern bird skull itself, very close to the origin of modern birds. So in order to try to shed a little bit of light on this problem, I became involved in some field work with collaborators of mine from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. So this was a few years ago. We went out to Colorado looking at fossil beds of about the same age of as Archaeopteryx, so about 150 million years old. And we were determined to find some exceptionally well-preserved fossils that would tell us a lot about the origin of modern birds. The problem is that going out into the field with the goal of doing something like that often leads to disappointment. So we were out in the field every day for 3 weeks, working really hard and looking as hard as we could to try to find fossils, and we found absolutely nothing. So this is another reality about being a paleontologist. Actually coming up with these sort of groundbreaking discoveries can be really challenging. But through an incredible stroke of luck, right around the time that we were wrapping up our disappointing field trip, I got a text message from a colleague of mine who was working in fossil beds from the next state over to the east. He was working in Kansas, and instead of working in fossil beds that were 150 million years old, he was looking in fossil beds that were 86 million years old. And that's a very interesting time in bird evolutionary history. So the end Cretaceous extinction event, when these stem group birds went extinct, happened 66 million years ago. So working in 86 million year old fossil beds gives you the opportunity to find fossils that are closely associated with the origin of modern birds themselves. So when I got that text message, he sent me this picture here, and he said, "Do you think this looks interesting?" And so I looked at it, and as you can tell, it really doesn't look like much initially, but there are a few things that jump out. First of all, it has a very nice coracoid. So as you might remember, this is the bone that really gives us a clear understanding of whether these animals would have been capable of modern flight or not. So instantly I was interested in that. And unlike most fossil birds, this contained multiple bones, very obviously. So it's not a beautiful skeleton like Archaeopteryx, but it seems to provide a lot of information. And so I became very interested in it, and I asked if I could study the specimen, and he was very willing to let me work on it. And so the more I looked at these pictures of the specimen, the more I became interested in one aspect of the specimen in particular. And it's not going to look like very much at first, and in fact, it took me a long time to realize what I was looking at. But the region of the specimen that became interesting to me was this portion of the specimen here. So I'll tell you what that portion of the specimen was in a second, but in order to get a better understanding of what that specimen was actually telling us, we didn't actually clear off all of the rock at first. Instead, we decided to apply a technique called high-resolution micro-CT scanning. So basically, we took that specimen and we got it X-rayed in a special machine that generates three-dimensional images of the bones inside that rock. So it costs a fair bit of money to do that sort of thing, but it has potential to actually tell us a lot about the anatomy of these fossils. So for example, what you're looking at here is a tooth from that beast that I just showed you. And the tooth, as you can see, is really, really tiny. So despite its small size, this high-resolution CT scanning that we performed allowed us to generate a nice three-dimensional model of the tooth. And very interestingly, this technique allows us to actually peer inside these fossils. So this is an 86-million-year-old fossil, had never been seen by human eyes before, and all of a sudden we're able to really study it in a level of detail that was really just totally unprecedented, even maybe 25 years ago. So this is very exciting. And in general, this technique of CT scanning is terrific because, first of all, studying specimens like this in close detail can provide us with new scientific insights, the likes of which we wouldn't have previously been able to have. But even more importantly than that, it provides a really useful tool for outreach. For example, this is the sort of thing that, if you put it on a screen in a museum, has potential to teach people a lot. And you can also send these sorts of data all around the world to your collaborators or other people involved in outreach in order to allow people to observe and study the sort of anatomy which otherwise would be very difficult for them to study. They would have to travel to the original museum collection where that fossil was held in order to look at the bones and maybe not make much sense out of them. So this kind of CT scanning technique is really exciting. So when we took a look at this fossil, and it became clear that this region of the specimen was interesting, we decided right then and there to subject this specimen to high-resolution CT scanning. And I really thought that this portion of the specimen might be a skull, but I wasn't totally sure. But it turns out, after CT scanning the specimen and spending a lot of time cleaning it up and putting the pieces together, the specimen turned out to look like this. So not only did the specimen turn out to contain a skull, but it actually happens to contain the most complete skull of any bird-like dinosaur from the entire age of reptiles themselves. So this particular specimen turns out to be incredibly important for teaching us about how the modern bird skull actually came to be. So if you look at this specimen closely, you'll see that, much like the skeleton of Archaeopteryx, this specimen contains a lot of features that we associate with modern birds, combined with features that we associate with their dinosaurian ancestors. So maybe the most immediate thing that jumps out is the mouth full of sharp teeth. But combined with that mouth full of sharp teeth, we see what we think of as an incipient beak, so restricted just to the tip of the jaws, what we think is the earliest manifestation of a toothless bill homologous with the toothless bill that we see in living birds themselves. So if we compare basically what we're able to see from this new specimen with what we knew about this particular fossil taxon before it was discovered, we see that we fill in a lot of holes. So this particular animal is called Ichthyornis, which means the fish bird, and it was originally discovered in the 1870s. So much like Archaeopteryx, it was of great interest to early evolutionary biologists and paleontologists because it was clearly a bird with teeth. But because the skull remains were so fragmentary from this animal, we really didn't know very much about its skull morphology at all. So from the point in time when it was discovered in the 1870s until the present day, this is really all we knew about the cranial form of this animal, Ichthyornis. But obviously, we're able to say a lot more about it now. So if we look at all of the bones that make up the skull of a bird, you can see that these initial remains from the 1870s left a lot of question marks because they simply weren't preserved or were preserved badly. And now with this new material, we're able to fill in lots of gaps and say more about this particular skull than we are able to say about the skull of any Oviolin from the Mesozoic. So arguably, the skull of Ichthyornis has gone from being relatively unknown to perhaps the best preserved of any Mesozoic Oviolin. So let's talk a little bit about the origin of the bird beak itself. So we can make comparisons of animals like Archaeopteryx, very early crownword stem group birds, with the skulls of modern birds. So this is a living bird called a tinamou. And some very important features jump out at us. Obviously, Archaeopteryx has sharp teeth, and living birds don't have teeth. But a little more subtle, but just as importantly, the bone shown in red here in Archaeopteryx, which we call the premaxilla, is very small, and the bone in green, which we call the maxilla, is very large. So together, those are the bones that make up the upper jaw of animals like birds and other reptiles. If we look at the skull of the tinamou in contrast, we see the opposite. We see a massive premaxilla. Essentially, the entire beak is made up of the premaxilla itself, with the maxilla much reduced and restricted just to a position at the back, forming part of the palate. So if we look at what Ichthyornis tells us, we see something interesting. So we see this incipient beak, whereby the premaxilla has lost its teeth, but in a unique way, we see a combination of this new toothless premaxilla with the retention of a very large, robust, and very much feathered dinosaur-like maxilla, essentially giving us a really clear intermediate picture of what the origin of the modern bill looked like. So if we look at the beaks of these animals sort of from underneath, we see some other interesting features too. So let's look at Ichthyornis. You can see that it has this very long tooth row associated with the maxilla. But if we look at the roof of the mouth, the palate, we see something interesting. So even in the premaxilla, where we don't have any teeth, we see an assortment of small holes. And those holes extend all the way down on the maxilla. And this is something we hadn't seen before. But when you actually look at how the upper jaw interacted with the lower jaw, you see that all of the teeth from the lower jaw actually slotted right in to those holes in the roof of the mouth of Ichthyornis, giving us a very strange and unanticipated look at what the roof of the mouth of this very strange early bird-like animal looked like. So the fact that these specimens were CT scanned and are three-dimensionally preserved means that we can get a much clearer picture of what the rest of the skull looks like as well. So in particular, I want to focus on this region at the back of the skull of Ichthyornis and make some comparisons with a few other animals as well. So Ichthyornis, as I've said, is one of the closest known relatives of modern birds from the age of dinosaurs. And when we compare Ichthyornis to a modern bird, this is the tinamou once again, and a carnivorous feathered dinosaur, much more distantly related to modern birds, we see some interesting features. And in particular, this portion of the skull is very interesting. If you can compare Ichthyornis to this carnivorous dinosaur and to the modern bird, you'll see that this region of the skull is much more similar in Ichthyornis to the carnivorous dinosaur than it is to the modern bird. So this is a region of the skull called the upper temporal fenestra, and it's a portion of the skull that houses large muscles related to biting very hard. So if we reconstruct this sort of approximate dimensions of the muscles that would have fit inside this region of the skull, you see that despite having sort of the earliest manifestation of a bird-like beak, the posterior portion of the skull of Ichthyornis is actually geometrically much more similar to the skull of an early carnivorous dinosaur than it is to a modern bird. So again, this is evidence of a very surprisingly late evolutionary retention of a plesiomorphic dinosaur-like feature. But CT scanning these fossils allows us to say something about the brains of these animals as well, because we're able to look inside the bones in order to reconstruct internal morphology. So this is that carnivorous dinosaur I was just showing you before, and this one has been CT scanned with the internal brain cavity shown in purple there, reconstructed in 3 dimensions. So this technique allows us to reconstruct what the brains of these dinosaurs and other early reptiles would have looked like and make comparisons with modern birds and other reptiles in order to understand how the modern bird brain has come to be. So if we look at the tinamou and extract a 3-dimensional model of its endocast, or basically a 3-dimensional model of what its brain looks like, compared to other living reptiles, this is a really large brain indeed, and it's got a very distinctive shape. It's very rounded, it's kind of folded on top of itself, and the forebrain is greatly expanded compared to what we see in other living reptiles. But if we make comparisons with earlier feathered dinosaurs like Archaeopteryx, we see a very different shape indeed. So the shape of the endocast in Archaeopteryx is much more elongated, and in general, the proportions of the forebrain are much smaller than what we see in living birds. And even though this portion of the skull is slightly crushed in Ichthyornis, we can nonetheless extract sort of an approximation of what those regions of the brain would have looked like. And what we see is an intermediate geometry between what we see in Archaeopteryx and living birds, with a forebrain that is expanded beyond what we see in early feathered dinosaurs like Archaeopteryx, but nonetheless not as expanded as what we see in living birds. So another sort of intermediate cranial condition in this animal. But that specimen, when we CT scanned it, of course, didn't only have a skull. It had essentially a near complete skeleton preserved in 3 dimensions as well. So as you can see here, we see a sternum with a very large sternal keel, suggesting that this animal probably would have been capable of strong flight. And in fact, the beak of Ichthyornis, that now famous beak, is basically stuck onto the sternum. The skeleton all sort of fell apart before it got preserved. But by focusing on different elements in succession, we can say some interesting things about the evolution of a geometrically modern bird skeleton. So we can take elements like the coracoid that we've already talked about, and we can assign geometric landmarks onto those bones, which means we can quantitatively compare the shape of this shoulder element, the coracoid, from Ichthyornis, and compare it both to living birds and to more distant Mesozoic bird relatives. So as you can see, when we perform sort of an early version of this landmark analysis of Ichthyornis, it essentially falls out within the range of variation of modern birds, suggesting that the shoulder and probably the rest of its wing function was relatively similar to what we see in living birds. And geometrically, that portion of the skeleton is very different from what we see in animals like Archaeopteryx and other early feathered dinosaurs from the Mesozoic, suggesting that even though the skull is strange and plesiomorphic in many ways, the postcranial skeleton, the rest of the skeleton, appears to be geometrically very similar to what we see in living birds. And the fact that that postcranial skeleton is 3-dimensionally preserved allows us to look more carefully at the function of the wings themselves. So if we take a modern bird like a partridge, we can CT scan it and we can begin to reconstruct in 3 dimensions essentially what its flight apparatus looks like. So here in red is that sternum with the sternal keel for the attachment of flight muscles. In blue, we have the coracoid. In orange, we have the scapula. And the rest of the wing, as you can see, inserts into that shoulder joint formed by the coracoid and scapula. So we can bring these 3-dimensional models into a 3-dimensional computing environment, and we can actually move the joints of these different regions of the wing, like the wrist and the elbow and the shoulder, in order to quantitatively compare how the range of motion of the wing of a modern bird compares with that of Ichthyornis. And we can even incorporate much earlier fossil representatives like Archaeopteryx in order to understand how the function of the wing has evolved over the last 150 million years. So this is still work in progress, but we're very excited about it. And a similar technique has been applied to the fossil record and a major locomotory transition a few years ago by Stephanie Pierce and her colleagues when they looked at this early, essentially intermediate terrestrial animal, Ichthyostega, and looked at its joint function in order to compare it with living amphibians and reptiles and even mammals like seals in order to understand how it was likely capable of moving around on land. So we're essentially trying to do the same sort of thing, looking at perhaps the other locomotor transition in the history of life that is as significant as the origin of terrestrial walking itself, and that would be the origin of flight in birds. So that brings me basically to the end of the talk, but I want to wrap up just by re-emphasizing how important studying fossils from this interval of evolutionary history can be towards bringing us closer to a more complete understanding of how what we think of today as modern bird biology has evolved. And hopefully additional work and additional discoveries along that particular region of the tree of life will give us, continue to give us a much more complete understanding of how these important biological specializations of modern birds have come to be. So I'd like to thank you very much again for the invitation to speak, and I'd be happy to address any questions that you might have.
How is that working in the field for a paleontologist?
How is it?
Yeah.
Well, when I decided to become a paleontologist, I decided that was the portion of the job that I was most interested in. So I've been interested in fossils for a very long time, since I was quite young, and I was always excited about the idea of going out and discovering fossils. So I didn't get a chance until I was about 18, around the time that I was starting my undergraduate degree. But I'm Canadian, and I had a chance to join a team of researchers studying dinosaurs in Western Canada. And my first sort of field experience was really exciting. It's amazing to have a chance to go out and realize that fossils are really out there, sort of waiting to be discovered. And the feeling of discovering a fossil that nobody else in the entire world has ever seen before and bringing it to the attention of the scientific community is fascinating and exciting. The one thing about being a field paleontologist that is a little bit disheartening sometimes is what I described to you before. Sometimes you know that a particular fossil showing particular features that would really shed light on important evolutionary questions, you know they're out there, and you know they're waiting to be found. And no matter how hard you try, unfortunately, sometimes you're just not going to be successful because fossils aren't always, especially exceptional fossils, aren't always easy to find. So,
how do you determine the portion of the area you're going to study?
Oh.
Like a demographic study before?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are essentially two things that you have to keep in mind. There are certain rocks that are likely to preserve fossils, and those are sedimentary rocks, usually rocks that are laid down either in the oceans or in lakes or by rivers. And based on kind of previous understanding of geochronology and the fossil record and the evolutionary, basically the evolutionary tree of life, you can attempt to roughly pinpoint rocks of the right age that might sort of be able to shed light on the sorts of evolutionary transitions that you find interesting. So a combination of looking for the right kinds of rocks of the right age will lead you to certain parts of the world where those rocks happen to be exposed. So the reason we were working in that particular portion of Colorado that summer is because the rocks in that portion of the world are the right age and of the right type to potentially hold an Archaeopteryx-like animal from North America. And it may well be true that an animal like that is out there waiting to be discovered. Unfortunately, though, after 3 weeks of trying, we just didn't find any evidence of it.
So it's not like the oil extraction, they take like a picture of the sea and they have probability areas where it's more likely to extract oil. It's not like the same with
Yeah, not really, right? So if you're sort of a petroleum geologist, you're looking for certain kinds of rocks that are likely to sort of serve as oil reservoirs, that are likely to yield oil kind of regardless of their precise age and regardless of their precise type. For a paleontologist, really, you're always looking for a combination of those two particular features, or the right kinds of rocks, sedimentary rocks, of the right age. And depending on your understanding of the biogeography of the animals that you're looking at, or organisms that you're looking at, maybe you can sort of restrict your search to certain regions of the world as well.
Those phylogenies are morphological phylogenies or is it a way?
Well, typically when you're working with fossil information, the only kind of phylogenies you're able to generate are morphological phylogenies. Fortunately, when you're dealing with sort of major macroevolutionary transitions, that is occasionally a situation in which a morphological phylogeny is likely to be able to be resolved consistently, where you sort of see consistent directional change. Nonetheless, there are obviously problems associated with inferring phylogenies based on morphology, and you see that the more taxa that you tend to add to anatomical phylogenies, the more homoplasy, which can be very problematic, tends to creep into your phylogenetic analyses. So there are lots of challenges that you have to sort of overcome in the process of generating these anatomical phylogenies. Of course, if you're dealing with very recent fossils, it might be possible to extract either protein sequences or ancient DNA from those recent fossils, which might allow you to incorporate these extinct organisms into molecular sequence-based phylogenetic analysis based either on mitochondrial DNA or, in rare cases, nuclear DNA as well.
This is the first image that you put in 3D of a bone. What was inside?
Oh, great question. So I think what I showed was, yeah, tooth. Dente? No? Dente? Okay. So tooth, so, pardon?
Inside.
Yes. So basically when you look inside this tiny little tooth from 86 million years ago, you can see the vascular canals that penetrated that tooth that were initially there when that tooth was inside the skull of a living animal. So if you look inside modern teeth as well, there's this complex network of sort of neurovascular canals that both innervate and vascularize the dentition.
You determine that because of the cavities inside the bone?
Yeah, based on those cavities inside the tooth, and so basically towards the base of the tooth, through the root of the tooth, that's where the tooth actually contacts the jaw, and of course it's through the jaw that vasculature and nerves penetrate the root of the tooth.
I think this kind of technique can be really helpful in understanding so many things. Can this CT scan can be applied to any? I mean, if you have a CT scan machine, can you apply it to any kind of fossils, or what requires that?
Yeah, so it depends. Obviously, if you have a specimen, and it doesn't have to be fossils either, of course it can be a modern zoological specimen as well, or even an artifact. If those specimens are free of sort of surrounding matrix, especially rock, often the quality of the scan will be much better, because then the X-rays don't have to penetrate the rock, and you can get into problematic situations if the density of the rock is very similar to the density of the fossil. It can be very difficult to separate the fossil material from the surrounding rock itself. Fortunately for us, when we CT scanned this particular specimen, not that one, but this one, the rock surrounding the bones is made up of chalk, so it's actually not dense at all. So this is mostly calcium carbonate. And so the density of the bones was greater than the density of the surrounding rock, which enabled us to take this very ugly looking fossil, pop it into the CT scanner, and discover that in 3 dimensions, the fossil is actually very nice.
Also, have you tried to partner with any kind of museum or something to show this kind of images? I think they are great.
Yeah, absolutely. So we really think that those sorts of 3-dimensional images, especially those ones that move, will be really useful for education, either in a museum setting or in other contexts as well. And so we have plans to sort of generate digital displays to sort of complement fossils themselves, which are static, don't move, and can sometimes be difficult to interpret, in order to maybe bring those fossils to life a little bit more and make it more exciting and informative for museum visitors. So we haven't actually done that yet, but I don't think it would be that hard to get maybe an iPad or a TV screen on display in order to sort of give us a high-resolution picture of what the fossils look like in 3D. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Muchas gracias.
Great.
Thank you very much.